The Comar scientist Linux never imagined a primitive human would be her salvation. As the celestial Voyager plummeted through Earth's atmosphere, alarms blared and consoles exploded. The unexpected solar flare had shattered their shields, leaving the advanced starship defenseless against the cosmic onslaught. Linux braced for impact as the ship crashed into a dense North American forest. Metal screamed and twisted. Bodies flew. When the chaos subsided, only silence remained. Linux found herself pinned beneath a twisted bulkhead, the lone survivor in a tomb of alien technology. Miles away, Forest Ranger Greg Robinson's radio crackled with reports of a disturbance. He spotted the plume of smoke rising above the tree line and gunned his off-road vehicle toward the source. Nothing in his training had prepared him for the sight that awaited. The sleek silver craft lay broken among splintered pines. Greg approached cautiously, his heart pounding. A faint cry reached his ears, distinctly non-human. He hesitated at the jagged opening torn in the hull. Every instinct screamed danger, yet he couldn't ignore a call for help. Greg squeezed through the gap, coughing in the acrid smoke. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a scene of destruction. Alien bodies lay motionless. Strange fluids pooled on warped deck plates. Another cry guided him deeper. He found her trapped beneath a fallen beam. Linux's violet eyes widened at the sight of the human. Greg's shock matched her own, but training took over. He assessed the situation, looking for a way to free the alien woman. As Greg worked to shift the debris, a new threat emerged. Flames licked at exposed wiring, inching toward what could only be an engine core. The air grew thick with toxic fumes. Greg redoubled his efforts, muscles straining against unyielding metal. With a final heave, Linux slipped free. Greg scooped her into his arms and ran. They burst from the ship seconds before it erupted in a fireball, peppering the forest with smoldering fragments of alien alloys. In the aftermath, Greg's mind raced. First contact had quite literally fallen into his lap. As Linux trembled in his arms, shock and grief etched on her features. He knew nothing would ever be the same. He fumbled for his satellite phone, dreading the call he had to make. Government vehicles would soon converge on their location. Scientists, soldiers, and officials would descend like vultures on the crash site. Greg looked down at Linux, her alien features both strange and vulnerable. A protective instinct surged within him. He had saved her life, but the ordeal was far from over. As the distant wail of sirens grew closer, Greg realized he stood at a crossroads of galactic proportions. His next actions could shape the course of human-alien relations for generations to come. Linux met his gaze, fear and gratitude warring in her expression. To her, humans had been dismissed as primitive. Now, one had risked everything to rescue her. As the weight of their shared experience settled over them, a connection sparked, one that would challenge both their preconceptions and the very foundations of their respective societies. The wail of sirens grew louder as Greg cradled Linux in his arms, her alien form trembling against his chest. He cast a final glance at the smoldering wreckage of the celestial Voyager before turning towards the convoy of vehicles approaching through the forest. Black SUVs screeched to a halt, kicking up clouds of dust. Men in dark suits and military fatigues poured out, weapons raised. Greg instinctively tightened his grip on Linux, shielding her from view. "U.S. government, put your hands where we can see them," a voice boomed through a megaphone. Greg's heart raced. He knew this moment would define everything that followed. Slowly, carefully, he lowered Linux to the ground and raised his hands. "My name is Greg Robinson. I'm a forest ranger," he called out. "This alien, her name is Linux, needs medical attention. I'm here to help." A tense silence followed. Then a figure stepped forward, a stern-faced man with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of a career military officer. "I'm Colonel James Hawkins," he announced. "You're coming with us, both of you." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Hazmat-suited personnel swarmed around them. Greg found himself whisked into one vehicle, while Linux was carefully loaded into another. As they sped away from the crash site, Greg craned his neck for one last glimpse of the alien he had saved. Her violet eyes met his briefly before the tinted windows obscured her from view. Hours of driving through winding back roads brought them to a sprawling complex in the heart of the desert. High fences topped with razor wire surrounded a cluster of nondescript buildings. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Greg's stomach knotted as he realized the gravity of the situation. Inside, he was led to a stark interrogation room. Colonel Hawkins loomed over him, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Start from the beginning," Hawkins ordered, "and don't leave anything out." Greg recounted the events leading up to the crash, his discovery of Linux, and their narrow escape. With each retelling, to Hawkins, then to a panel of stone-faced intelligence officers, he felt his actions scrutinized and dissected. "You took an enormous risk," Hawkins said, his voice permeated with disapproval. "That alien could have been hostile. You might have exposed the entire planet to an extraterrestrial threat." "She was hurt," Greg countered. "I couldn't just leave her to die." Hawkins's lips thinned. "Your compassion is admirable, Mr. Robinson, but it may have consequences beyond your comprehension." Days blurred together as Greg endured endless debriefings. Between sessions, he was confined to sparse quarters under constant surveillance. His thoughts constantly drifted to Linux. Was she all right? Were they treating her well? He voiced his concerns repeatedly, only to be stonewalled by Hawkins and his subordinates. Meanwhile, in another wing of the facility, Linux found herself in a sterile chamber, unlike anything she had ever seen. Strange machines hummed and beeped around her. Humans in protective gear moved about, their faces obscured behind masks and visors. Dr. Sarah Chen approached, her movements slow and deliberate. "Hello," she said softly, gesturing to herself. "I'm Sarah. Can you understand me?" Linux's brow furrowed. The human's vocalizations were unfamiliar, nothing like the complex harmonics of her own language. She tried to respond, but her words emerged as a series of musical tones that left the humans baffled. Sarah sighed, turning to her colleague. "We need to establish some form of communication. For now, let's focus on non-invasive scans and observation." Over the following days, Linux underwent a battery of tests. Imaging devices mapped her internal structures. Sensors analyzed her biochemistry. With each new discovery, Dr. Chen's excitement grew. "The similarities are remarkable," she told her team. "Bilateral symmetry, comparable organ systems. It's as if we evolved on parallel tracks." But for Linux, each procedure brought fresh waves of anxiety. The constant prodding and scanning wore on her already frayed nerves. She longed for the familiar warmth of her homeworld, for the comforting presence of her own kind. Most of all, she found herself wishing for the human who had pulled her from the wreckage, the one called Greg. As another day faded into night, Greg lay awake in his quarters, mind racing. He had to see her, to make sure she was okay. The security protocols he had observed during his time in the facility coalesced into a plan. When the night shift changed, Greg slipped from his room. He moved silently through dimly lit corridors, ducking into alcoves whenever patrols passed. His heart pounded as he neared the medical wing. There, through an observation window, he saw her. Linux huddled on a bed, her violet skin pale under harsh fluorescent lights. She looked small, frightened. Greg's chest tightened at the sight. Without thinking, he keyed in the access code he had memorized earlier. The door hissed open. Linux's head snapped up, her eyes widening in recognition. Greg approached slowly, hands raised in a gesture of peace. He smiled, pointing to himself. "Greg," he said softly. "I'm Greg. Remember me?" Understanding dawned in Linux's eyes. She reached out tentatively, her slender fingers brushing against Greg's outstretched hand. A look of relief washed over her alien features. The tender moment shattered as alarms blared throughout the facility. Red emergency lights bathed the room in an eerie glow. Greg whirled to see armed guards racing down the hallway, Colonel Hawkins at their head. "Robinson!" Hawkins bellowed. "Step away from the alien immediately!" Greg planted himself between Linux and the approaching soldiers. "Wait!" he shouted. "She's not dangerous. We need to treat her with respect, not like some lab specimen." The confrontation teetered on the edge of violence. Guards leveled their weapons at Greg and Linux. Hawkins's face flushed with anger. "Stand down, Robinson," he growled. "That's an order." "Stop!" The new voice cut through the tension like a knife. A distinguished-looking man in a tailored suit strode into view, his presence commanding instant attention. "I'm Ambassador Michael Reeves," he announced, "and I'm ordering everyone to lower their weapons. Now!" Hawkins hesitated, then nodded to his men. Slowly, the guns lowered. Reeves turned to Greg, his expression thoughtful. "You've formed a connection with our guest, haven't you?" Greg nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Good," Reeves said. "We need that. This isn't just about national security anymore. It's about forging a relationship between two civilizations." He addressed the room at large. "From this moment on, we treat Linux as an honored envoy, not a threat or research subject. Mr. Robinson will serve as her liaison and interpreter." Hawkins sputtered in protest, but Reeves silenced him with a look. "The world is watching, Colonel. We have a chance to make history here, the right way." As the tension in the room slowly dissipated, Greg felt Linux's hand slip into his. He gave it a reassuring squeeze, marveling at the surreal turn of events. Reeves smiled at the pair. "I believe you two have a lot to teach us about building bridges across the stars." Outside the facility, unbeknownst to the humans, a faint signal pulsed from the wreckage of the celestial Voyager. It streamed into the cosmos, carrying news of Linux's survival, and of the strange world where she had found an unexpected ally. Its message streaked across light years, carrying hope of rescue and the promise of a momentous encounter between two civilizations. Within the facility, the atmosphere shifted from tense confrontation to cautious optimism. Ambassador Reeves's intervention had opened a new chapter in human-alien relations, with Greg at its center. In the days that followed, he found himself thrust into a role he never could have imagined: liaison between humanity and its first confirmed extraterrestrial visitor. Greg's days filled with a whirlwind of activity. He spent hours with Linux, helping her acclimate to Earth's environment and customs. They developed a rudimentary form of communication, a blend of gestures, drawings, and simple words. Greg found himself captivated by Linux's quick intelligence and curious nature. "This water?" Linux asked haltingly, pointing to a glass on the table. Greg nodded, smiling encouragingly. "Yes, water. We drink it." He demonstrated, taking a sip. Linux mimicked the action, her eyes widening at the cool sensation. As they worked together, Greg shared aspects of human culture, music, art, and technology. In return, Linux offered glimpses into Komar society through elaborate holograms projected from a device she wore on her wrist. One evening, as they sat reviewing Earth's languages, Linux placed her hand on Greg's arm. The touch sent a jolt through him, a mix of surprise and something deeper he couldn't quite name. "Greg, friend?" Linux said softly, her violet eyes meeting his. He felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Yes, Linux, we're friends." Their growing bond did not go unnoticed. Dr. Sarah Chen observed their interactions with keen interest, particularly as she and her team made breakthroughs in translating the Komar language. "The neural patterns are fascinatingly complex," she explained to Ambassador Reeves during a briefing. "But we've managed to create a rudimentary translation device. It should allow for more nuanced communication." The device, when activated, transformed Linux's musical tones into halting English. With this new tool, the exchange of knowledge accelerated rapidly. "Our people," Linux explained during one session, her words filtered through the translator, "are part of a greater community, many species united across stars." The implications stunned the assembled human officials. Earth was not just making first contact with the Komar, but potentially with an entire galactic civilization. As information about Linux's presence leaked to the public, reactions varied wildly. Outside the facility's walls, crowds gathered. Some carried signs welcoming Earth's cosmic neighbor, while others demanded her immediate deportation. Greg watched the news broadcast with growing concern. The world seemed to be dividing itself into factions, those who saw Linux as an opportunity for advancement, and those who viewed her as a threat to humanity's autonomy. "We cannot allow an alien presence to corrupt our way of life," one protester shouted on a news segment. Linux, who had been quietly observing the broadcast, turned to Greg with distress evident in her features. "They fear me?" she asked, the translator conveying her dismay. Greg placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Some do," he admitted, "but many are excited to meet you. Change is always scary for some people." As the days passed, Greg noticed Linux becoming increasingly withdrawn. He found her one evening, huddled in a corner of her room, her eyes fixed on a small view screen. "What's wrong?" he asked, crouching beside her. Linux gestured to the screen, where images of protest flashed by. "Your world, divided because of me. Perhaps I should not be here." Greg's heart clenched at the sadness in her voice. An idea formed in his mind, one that might help Linux understand humanity beyond the confines of the facility and the harsh glare of the media. He approached Ambassador Reeves with his proposal. "Let me take Linux outside," he urged. "Somewhere quiet, away from crowds. She needs to experience Earth firsthand, not just through screens and reports." Reeves considered the request, his brow furrowed. "It's risky," he mused. "But you may be right. A controlled excursion could be beneficial." He nodded to himself, coming to a decision. "I'll allow it, but with conditions. You'll have a security detail, led by Major Sloan. He's level-headed, shares your approach to our guest." The next morning, a small convoy departed the facility. Greg sat beside Linux in one of the vehicles, watching her reaction as the desert landscape gave way to forested hills. They arrived at a secluded area of a nearby national park, far from the usual tourist trails. As Linux stepped from the vehicle, her eyes widened in wonder. She knelt, running her fingers through the grass, inhaling deeply of the pine-scented air. Greg felt a surge of joy at her obvious delight. "This is Earth," he said softly. "The real Earth." They spent hours exploring. Linux marveled at the diverse flora and fauna, asking endless questions about each new discovery. Major Sloan and his team maintained a discreet perimeter, allowing Greg and Linux space to interact naturally. The idyllic outing took an unexpected turn when they encountered a group of hikers on a remote trail. Recognition dawned on the humans' faces, followed quickly by a mix of awe and fear. "It's her!" one of the hikers exclaimed. "The alien!" Word spread rapidly. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered, their numbers swelling as curious onlookers arrived. The atmosphere grew tense as some individuals began shouting hostile remarks. "Go back to your own planet!" someone yelled, their face contorted with anger. Major Sloan and his team formed a protective barrier around Linux, while Greg tried to calm the agitated crowd. "Please," he called out, "she's not a threat. We have a chance to learn from each other." His words fell on deaf ears. The situation escalated rapidly, the crowd pressing closer, their shouts growing more aggressive. Suddenly, a rock arced through the air, striking Linux on the shoulder. Time seemed to slow. Greg watched in horror as magenta blood welled from the wound. The sight of the alien blood shocked the crowd into silence. Greg rushed to Linux's side, cradling her injured arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. Linux nodded, her eyes locked on Greg's face. In that moment, something shifted between them. The gentle care in Greg's touch, the naked concern in his eyes. It spoke volumes about the best of humanity, a stark contrast to the fear and aggression they'd just witnessed. As Major Sloan's team hurried them back to the vehicles, Greg felt Linux's hand slip into his. She squeezed it gently, a gesture of trust and something more, a deepening connection that transcended their differences. The incident created a media firestorm. Upon their return to the facility, Ambassador Reeves was forced to hold an emergency press conference, confirming Linux's presence on Earth and appealing for calm and understanding. "We stand at a crossroads," Reeves declared, his voice steady despite the chaos of shouted questions. "How we respond to this unprecedented situation will define us as a species. I urge everyone to approach this with open minds and open hearts." In the days that followed, the global response fractured along predictable lines. Some nations called for open cooperation with the Comar, eager to benefit from their advanced technology. Others demanded Linux be turned over to an international authority, citing security concerns. Amidst the political turmoil, Dr. Chen made a discovery that would reshape the entire equation. She burst into Ambassador Reeves's office, her eyes wide with excitement and trepidation. "Sir," she said, her voice quavering slightly, "I've found something in Lennox's latest medical scans. Something impossible." Reeves leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What is it, doctor?" Chen took a deep breath. "Lennox is pregnant, and based on the genetic markers, it appears to be a human Comar hybrid." The implications hit Reeves like a physical blow. He sank back in his chair, mind turning. "How?" he managed to ask. "I can only assume it happened during the initial rescue," Chen replied. "The prolonged close contact between Lennox and Mr. Robinson." Reeves nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. "We need to keep this quiet for now," he said. "The situation is volatile enough without adding this to the mix." He paused, considering. "Bring Robinson in. He needs to know." When Greg entered the office, the grave expressions on Reeves's and Chen's faces sent a chill through him. As they explained the situation, he felt the room tilt around him. "I'm going to be a father?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reeves nodded. "It appears so, and not just any father, the first human to have a child with an extraterrestrial being. The implications are staggering." Greg's mind whirled. He thought of Lennox, of the connection they'd formed. Now there was a new life binding them together, a bridge between their two species. "Does Lennox know?" he asked. "Not yet," Chen replied. "We wanted to inform you first." Greg straightened, a sudden clarity cutting through his shock. "I need to tell her. It should come from me." As he left the office, heading towards Lennox's quarters, Greg felt the weight of the future pressing down on him. He knew that nothing would ever be the same, for him, for Lennox, or for the two civilizations now inextricably linked by the life growing within her. The facility buzzed with scarcely controlled energy, unaware of the even more extraordinary development unfolding in their midst. And far above, beyond the reach of Earth's atmosphere, the faint distress signal from Lennox's crashed ship continued its lonely journey into the depths of space, carrying with it the promise of rescue and the potential for a far more complex first contact than anyone could have imagined. As Greg left Ambassador Reeves's office, his mind reeled with the implications of Dr. Chen's revelation. He made his way through the facility's sterile corridors, each step bringing him closer to a conversation that would change everything. He found Lennox in her quarters, gazing out the reinforced window at the desert landscape beyond. She turned as he entered, her violet eyes lighting up with warmth. "Greg," she said, her translator rendering the musical tones of her language into English. "You seem troubled." He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Lennox, there's something we need to talk about. Dr. Chen found something in your latest scans." As Greg explained the situation, Lennox's expression shifted from confusion to wonder. She placed a hand on her abdomen, her fingers splaying across the smooth surface of her exoskeleton. "A child?" she whispered. "Our child?" Greg nodded, watching her carefully. "I know it's a lot to take in. I'm still processing it myself." Lennox's eyes met his, filled with a mix of emotions he couldn't fully decipher. "In my culture, the creation of new life is sacred, but this is unprecedented." Before Greg could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Chen entered, her face a mask of professional concern. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said, "but Ambassador Reeves has called an emergency meeting. We need to discuss this development immediately." The meeting room crackled with tension as Ambassador Reeves addressed the small group gathered around the table. Greg sat beside Lennox, acutely aware of the eyes that kept darting towards her midsection. "We're in uncharted territory," Reeves began, his voice grave. "The implications of this pregnancy are staggering, both scientifically and diplomatically. Our immediate priority must be to keep this information contained." Colonel Hawkins leaned forward, his heart made. "Agreed. If this gets out, we'll have a global panic on our hands, not to mention the security nightmare." Dr. Chen nodded, pulling up a series of complex genetic charts on the room's main screen. "I've already begun intensive research on Comar human genetic compatibility. The pregnancy appears to be progressing at an accelerated rate. Based on my initial calculations, we can expect the child to be born within 3 months." Greg felt Lennox stiffen beside him. He reached for her hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Ambassador Reeves rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation evident in the set of his shoulders. All right, we keep this under wraps for now. Dr. Chen, I want you to focus all your resources on ensuring the health and safety of both Linux and the child. Colonel Hawkins will need to tighten security even further. No unauthorized personnel in or out of the facility. As the meeting concluded, Greg and Linux found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Chen's team began a rigorous schedule of examinations and tests, monitoring every aspect of the unprecedented pregnancy. Days blurred into weeks, and Greg watched as Linex's body began to change. The smooth contours of her exoskeleton developed a subtle swelling, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but a source of constant fascination for the human scientists. One evening, as they sat together in Linux's quarters, she turned to Greg with a pained expression. "It hurts," she said softly, her hand resting on her abdomen. "My body was not designed for this." Greg felt a surge of protectiveness. He moved closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I'm here," he murmured. "Whatever you need, I'm here." As Linux leaned into his embrace, Greg realized how much their relationship had shifted. What had begun as a fascinating cultural exchange had evolved into something deeper, more intimate. He found himself grappling with emotions he never expected to feel for an extraterrestrial being. Their moment of quiet was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Greg opened the door to find Dr. Chen engaged in a heated discussion with a tall, distinguished-looking man he didn't recognize. "Greg," Dr. Chen said, her voice tight with impossibly strong frustration. "This is Dr. Alan Roth. He's a xenobiologist from another institution. Ambassador Reeves has granted him clearance to join our research team." Dr. Roth extended a hand, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Mr. Robinson, it's an honor to meet you. I look forward to working closely with you and our guest." Greg shook the offered hand, noting the calculating gleam in Roth's gaze. Something about the man set him on edge, but he pushed the feeling aside. If Ambassador Reeves had cleared him, surely he could be trusted. As the days passed, Greg found himself dividing his time between supporting Linux through her increasingly difficult pregnancy and fielding an endless barrage of questions from Dr. Roth. The xenobiologist's curiosity seemed insatiable, his inquiries probing into every aspect of Linux's biology and their interactions. Outside the facility's walls, public interest in Linux reached a fever pitch. Greg caught glimpses of the media frenzy on TV screens throughout the compound, crowds gathering, reporters speculating wildly about the nature of the alien visitor. One afternoon, as Greg was helping Linux through a particularly painful bout of discomfort, Dr. Chen burst into the room, her face pale. "We have a problem," she said, her voice hushed. "Someone's leaked information about Linux to the internet. Conspiracy theories are spreading like wildfire." Greg felt a chill run down his spine. He thought of the hostile faces in the crowd during their ill-fated excursion, the rock that had drawn Linux's magenta blood. "How bad is it?" he asked. Dr. Chen's expression was grim. "Bad enough. There's a group gaining traction online, led by someone calling himself Marcus Graves. They're calling for Linux to be deported or eliminated." Linux, who had been listening quietly, placed a hand on Greg's arm. "Perhaps it would be better if I left," she said softly. "I do not wish to bring harm to your world." Greg shook his head vehemently. "No, you're not going anywhere. We'll figure this out." As if in response to the rising tensions, Ambassador Reeves implemented stricter security measures. Armed guards patrolled the facility's perimeter, and all non-essential personnel were restricted to specific areas. The increased security, however, only seemed to fuel the public's curiosity and suspicion. News helicopters began circling the facility, their cameras trained on the nondescript buildings that now held the key to humanity's cosmic future. Greg felt the pressure mounting, the weight of his impending fatherhood, compounded by the global implications of their situation. He found an unlikely confidant in Major Sloan, whose steady presence offered a grounding influence amidst the chaos. "I never asked for any of this," Greg confessed one evening, as they stood watching the distant lights of media encampments on the horizon. "Now I'm responsible for not just a child, but potentially the future of two species." Sloan clasped Greg's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. No one ever asks for greatness, Robinson. It finds us, ready or not. All we can do is rise to the occasion. As Greg opened his mouth to respond, a shrill alarm cut through the night air. Red emergency lights began flashing throughout the facility, and the intercom crackled to life with Dr. Chen's urgent voice. All senior personnel report to the main lab immediately. We've detected a signal from deep space. Greg's heart raced as he sprinted towards the lab, leaving Sloan to coordinate the security response. He burst through the doors to find Dr. Chen bent over a console, her fingers flying across the keys. What is it? He gasped, fighting to catch his breath. Dr. Chen looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and fear. The distress signal from Linux's ship. It's intensified, and we've detected a response. The implications hit Greg like a physical blow. You mean... Dr. Chen nodded slowly. Yes, it appears a Komar rescue mission might be on its way to Earth. As the facility erupted into frenzied activity, Greg's mind whirled with the possibilities. The arrival of more Komar could change everything, for Linux, for their unborn child, and for the future of human-alien relations. He turned to find Linux standing in the doorway, one hand resting protectively on her swollen abdomen. Their eyes met, and in that moment Greg understood that they stood on the precipice of a new era, one that would reshape the destiny of two worlds. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Greg's shoulders as he realized the monumental task that lay ahead. Before they could fully process the implications of the Komar rescue mission, a new crisis emerged. Dr. Chen's face paled as she studied the readouts on her screen. Greg, we have a problem. Your blood work shows anomalies consistent with exposure to Linux's blood during the incident at the press conference. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Greg felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. What does that mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We don't know the full effects yet, but we can't risk contamination. I'm sorry, but we need to quarantine you and any other staff who were exposed immediately. The next few hours passed in a blur as Greg and several other staff members were quickly isolated in a separate wing of the facility. Through the observation window, he watched helplessly as Linux was taken to the medical bay, her condition visibly deteriorating. Days blurred together as Dr. Chen and her team worked tirelessly to develop a treatment. Greg paced his quarantine room, consumed by worry for Linux and their unborn child. The isolation gnawed at him, amplifying his fears and doubts. Finally, after a week that felt like an eternity, Dr. Chen appeared at his door, her exhausted face bearing a glimmer of hope. We've developed a treatment to neutralize the potential effects of Linux's blood on human physiology, she explained. We'll begin administering it immediately. The treatment process was grueling, but Greg endured it without complaint, his thoughts fixed on reuniting with Linux. As the days passed and no adverse reactions appeared, hope began to replace fear. The moment Greg was cleared from quarantine, he rushed to Linux's side. He found her in the medical bay, her once vibrant exoskeleton now dull and lifeless. Dr. Chen stood nearby, her expression grim. The pregnancy has progressed rapidly during your absence, she explained softly. It's putting severe strain on her body. We need to perform an emergency C-section to save them both. Greg's heart raced as he took Linux's hand, feeling the faint tremor that ran through her body. I'm here, he whispered. I'm not leaving you again. The operating room buzzed with tense energy as Dr. Chen and her team prepared for the procedure. Greg, clad in sterile gear, stood at Linux's head, his eyes never leaving her face. Are you ready? Dr. Chen asked, her voice muffled by her surgical mask. Greg nodded, unable to find his voice. The next moments passed in a blur of controlled chaos, the hiss of medical equipment, the tense murmur of the surgical team, and finally, a cry that seemed to transcend species. It's a boy, Dr. Chen announced, her voice filled with wonder. She held up the infant, a striking blend of human and Komar features. His skin shimmered with a faint iridescence, and his eyes, when they opened, were a deep, mesmerizing violet. As Greg cradled his son for the first time, he felt a surge of love and protectiveness, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Zephyr, he whispered, the name coming to him unbidden. His name is Zephyr. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Linux recovered slowly but steadily, her body adapting to the massive changes it had undergone. Zephyr, meanwhile, astounded the facility staff with his rapid development. Within days, he was grasping basic concepts and exhibiting signs of advanced intelligence far beyond that of a human infant. Greg watched in amazement as Zephyr absorbed information at an unprecedented rate, his young mind seeming to bridge the gap between human and Komar cognition effortlessly. It was a source of both pride and concern. What would it mean for Zephyr's future, caught between two worlds? The peaceful bubble of new parenthood was shattered abruptly one morning as alarms blared throughout the facility. Greg rushed to the command center, Zephyr secured in a sling against his chest, to find Ambassador Reeves addressing a grim-faced group of world leaders on the main screen. "The Komar ship has entered our solar system," Reeves announced, his voice tight with tension. "We're facing a global panic situation. I've been appointed as Earth's chief negotiator, but we're facing significant opposition." On secondary screens, Greg saw images of massive protests erupting across the globe. At the forefront of many stood a charismatic figure he recognized from news reports, Marcus Graves, the self-appointed leader of the anti-alien movement. "They're calling for immediate military action against the Komar vessel," Colonel Hawkins reported, his face etched with concern. "Several countries are already mobilizing their forces." Ambassador Reeves turned to Greg, his eyes landing on Zephyr. "We need to use you, Linux, and your child as a bridge between our species. It may be our only hope for peaceful relations." Before Greg could respond, the facility shook with a distant explosion. Colonel Hawkins barked orders into his comm unit, his face grim. "We've got hostiles approaching the perimeter. We need to move you to a secure location immediately." Heart pounding, Greg raced back to Linux's room. He found her already alert, her body tense with anticipation. "We need to go," he said, helping her to her feet. "It's not safe here anymore." They were quickly ushered through a series of hidden passages, eventually emerging in an underground bunker Greg hadn't known existed. Dr. Chen and a small team of trusted personnel joined them, bringing essential equipment and supplies. As they settled into their new, confined quarters, a message crackled over the emergency broadcast system. The Komar ship had entered Earth's orbit and was transmitting in multiple human languages. "People of Earth," the message began, "we come in peace, seeking to reunite with our lost daughter and to establish diplomatic relations with your species. We have observed your world for centuries, waiting for the right moment to make contact." The implications of this revelation hit Greg like a physical blow. He turned to Linux, seeing the conflict in her eyes. "Did you know about this?" he asked softly. Linux shook her head, her expression troubled. "I had no knowledge of any long-term observation. Greg, I'm not sure I want to return to my people. Zephyr, this has become my home." As Greg grappled with this new information, Dr. Chen burst into the room, her face pale. "We have another problem," she announced. "Dr. Roth has escaped the facility, and he's taken crucial data about Linux and Zephyr's biology with him." The gravity of the situation settled over the group like a heavy shroud. With Roth at large and armed with sensitive information, the delicate balance they had been struggling to maintain was now at risk of total collapse. In the tense silence that followed, Zephyr stirred in Greg's arms, his violet eyes gleaming with an intelligence that seemed far beyond his few days of life. As Greg looked down at his son, he realized that the fate of two worlds now rested, in part, on the tiny shoulders of this unprecedented child. The bunker's communication system crackled to life, carrying Ambassador Reeves' voice. "I'm arranging a meeting with the Komar representatives on the International Space Station," he announced. "It's our best chance for peaceful negotiation." As the implications of this decision rippled through the group, Greg held Linux and Zephyr close, acutely aware that they stood at the center of a cosmic crossroads. Whatever came next would shape not just their family's future, but the course of human history and the future of interstellar relations. Relations. Greg's grip tightened on Linux's hand as the weight of their situation bore down on him. Colonel Hawkins burst into the room, his face etched with concern. "We've implemented a new security protocol, Elite guards will be rotating shifts to protect the facility. He paused, his eyes darting to Zephyr. We can't take any chances. Greg nodded, grateful for the extra precautions. But as the days wore on in the confines of the underground bunker, a sense of unease grew. Zephyr's development continued at an astonishing pace. At just a few weeks old, he was already exhibiting cognitive abilities far beyond his age. One morning, Greg watched in amazement as Zephyr stacked blocks with precise movements, creating complex structures that shouldn't have been possible for an infant. Lynx approached, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and concern. He's communicating with me, she said softly, placing a hand on Zephyr's head. Not with words, but I can feel his thoughts, his emotions. Greg's brow furrowed. Telepathy? Is that normal for Komar children? Lynx shook her head. No, this is unprecedented. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen's urgent entrance. Ambassador Reeves is departing for the International Space Station, she announced. He's meeting with the Komar representatives. The news sent a ripple of tension through the bunker. As they gathered around the communication console, they listened to reports of global military forces on high alert. The fate of Earth seemed to hang in the balance. Unbeknownst to them, outside forces were converging. Marcus Graves, the charismatic leader of the anti-alien movement, had been piecing together information from government insiders. His network of sympathizers had finally given him what he needed, the location of the secret bunker. Miles away, in a nondescript laboratory, Dr. Roth hunched over a microscope. His betrayal of the team had led him to the Human Purity Front, an extremist group even more radical than Graves's faction. Their goal was simple: eliminate all alien influence on Earth. The hybrid's genetic structure is fascinating, Roth muttered to his new colleagues. With this data, we can create a targeted bioweapon. It will affect not just the Komar, but the child as well. Back in the bunker, Greg struggled to connect with Zephyr. The boy's rapid growth and extraordinary abilities created a chasm between them. As Zephyr sat engrossed in a complex holographic puzzle, Greg approached hesitantly. Hey, buddy, he said, crouching beside his son. Want to take a break? Maybe we could read a story together? Zephyr turned, his violet eyes seeming to peer into Greg's soul. For a moment, Greg felt a flicker of something, a tendril of thought, an emotion not his own. Then it was gone, leaving him disoriented and awed. The moment was shattered by the sudden blare of alarms. Colonel Hawkins's voice crackled over the intercom. We're under attack. All non-essential personnel to the safe rooms immediately. Chaos erupted. The sound of explosions and gunfire filtered through the bunker's thick walls. Greg scooped up Zephyr, his heart pounding. Lynx, we need to move! They ran through the corridors, joining the stream of panicked researchers. Dr. Chen appeared, her face pale but determined. This way, she urged, leading them down a hidden passage. There's an emergency exit. It's your only chance. Greg hesitated, looking back at the sounds of battle. What about the others? Dr. Chen's expression hardened. We'll hold them off. You three are too important. You need to survive. With a heavy heart, Greg followed Dr. Chen to a concealed hatch. She thrust a backpack into his hands. Emergency supplies. There's a communication device inside. Stay hidden. Stay safe. As they emerged into the cool night air, the sounds of conflict faded behind them. Greg, Lynx, and Zephyr plunged into the wilderness, their future uncertain. Days passed as they trekked through harsh terrain, relying on Lynx's survival instincts and the meager supplies they carried. Zephyr, despite his young age, seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. He remained quiet, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. On the fifth night, as they huddled around a small fire, the portable communicator crackled to life. Ambassador Reeves's voice came through, tense and tired. The negotiations are complicated, he reported. The Komar offer is generous, advanced technology, knowledge, a place in their galactic federation. But they're concerned about Earth's readiness. The attack on the bunker has only heightened their doubts. Greg exchanged a worried glance with Lynx. What about us? He asked. Do they know we've escaped? Colonel Hawkins repelled the attack, but the facility was badly damaged. They're searching for you now. Stay hidden, stay safe. I'll contact you when I can. As the transmission ended, Greg noticed movement in the shadows beyond their campfire. He tensed, reaching for Zephyr. A figure stepped into the light, a Native American man with weathered features and keen eyes. Behind him, several others emerged from the darkness. "I am John Redfeather," the man said, his voice calm but wary. "We've been tracking you for days. You're a long way from home." Greg stood slowly, placing himself between the newcomers and his family. "We mean no harm. We're just trying to survive." Redfeather's gaze fell on Linux, then Zephyr. His eyes widened slightly, but he showed no fear. "The spirits speak of great change coming," he said softly. "Perhaps you are part of it." After a tense moment, Redfeather nodded to himself. "Come, we have a camp nearby. You'll be safer with us than alone in these woods." As they followed Redfeather's group, Greg felt a mix of relief and apprehension. They had found allies, but for how long? And what new dangers might be lurking on the horizon? Miles away in the damaged bunker, Colonel Hawkins surveyed the aftermath of the attack, his fist tight as he received reports of Greg, Linux, and Zephyr's disappearance. "Find them," he ordered his team. "Whatever it takes, the future of Earth may depend on it." In orbit, aboard the International Space Station, Ambassador Reeves faced the imposing figure of High Emissary Zorax. The Komar leader's multifaceted eyes seemed to pierce through Reeves's diplomatic facade. "Your world teeters on the brink of chaos," Zorax intoned. "How can we trust humanity with the knowledge and power we offer, when you cannot even ensure the safety of a single family?" Reeves steeled himself, knowing that his next words could determine the fate of human-alien relations. The negotiation that would shape Earth's cosmic future was just the beginning. As the transmission ended, Greg noticed movement in the shadows beyond their campfire. He tensed, reaching for Zephyr. A figure stepped into the light, a Native American man with weathered features and keen eyes. Behind him, several others emerged from the darkness. "I am John Redfeather," the man said, his voice calm but wary. "We've been tracking you for days. You're a long way from home." Greg stood slowly, placing himself between the newcomers and his family. "We mean no harm. We're just trying to survive." Redfeather's gaze fell on Linux, then Zephyr. His eyes widened slightly, but he showed no fear. "The spirits speak of great change coming," he said softly. "Perhaps you are part of it." After a tense moment, Redfeather nodded to himself. "Come, we have a camp nearby. You'll be safer with us than alone in these woods." As they followed Redfeather's group through the dense forest, Greg felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The Native American camp, hidden in a remote valley, offered a temporary respite from the chaos they'd left behind. Redfeather's people welcomed them with cautious hospitality, providing food and shelter. Over the next few days, Redfeather observed Zephyr with growing fascination. The child, now resembling a human toddler, displayed cognitive abilities far beyond his apparent age. One afternoon, as Zephyr arranged small stones in intricate patterns, Redfeather approached Greg and Linux. "Your child is special," he said, his voice low. "He bridges two worlds. We will help protect you, for his sake and for the future of all peoples." Greg nodded gratefully, but his relief was short-lived. That night, Zephyr woke screaming, his small body trembling. As Lennox cradled him, the child's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "Danger," Zephyr whispered, his first spoken words sending chills down Greg's spine. "Coming." Miles away in a sterile laboratory, Dr. Roth hunched over a microscope, his face illuminated by harsh fluorescent light. Around him, members of the Human Purity Front worked feverishly, preparing vials of a pale blue liquid. "The bioweapon is ready," Roth announced, a note of triumph in his voice. "Distribute it to our operatives worldwide. Soon we'll cleanse Earth of all alien influence." As the Human Purity Front set their plan in motion, tensions escalated on the International Space Station. Ambassador Reeves faced High Emissary Zorax, the Komar leader's multifaceted eyes reflecting the stars visible through the station's viewport. "Your world descends into chaos," Zorax intoned, his voice resonating with disappointment. "Perhaps we were mistaken in offering an alliance. A galactic quarantine may be the only safe option." Reeves felt the weight of Earth's future on his shoulders. "Please," he implored, Give us one more chance. Let me show you the potential for cooperation between our species. Back in Redfeather's camp, Zephyr's distress intensified. The child, now appearing closer to 5 years old, suffered from vivid nightmares and waking visions. Greg and Linux watched helplessly as their son struggled with his growing powers. Their sanctuary was shattered by the arrival of Colonel Hawkins. The military man approached the camp alone, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Greg tensed, ready to flee, but Hawkins's next words stopped him cold. "I'm not here to take you in," Hawkins said, his voice gruff. "I'm here to warn you. Both government forces and anti-alien extremists are closing in. You're not safe here anymore." As Greg processed this information, Zephyr suddenly collapsed. The child's body convulsed, his eyes rolling back. When he regained consciousness moments later, his gaze held a new depth of understanding. "The bad people," Zephyr said, his voice unnaturally mature. "They made something to hurt Mom and the others like her. We have to stop them." Greg exchanged a shocked look with Linux. Somehow their son had gained knowledge of the bioweapon threat. Even more incredibly, Zephyr began to communicate telepathically, his thoughts reaching not only his parents, but also Redfeather and Hawkins. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Greg made a decision. "We need to leave," he told the others. "We have to warn everyone, humans and Komar alike." Hawkins nodded grimly. "There's a secure communication facility about 100 miles from here. If we can reach it, we might be able to broadcast a message globally and to the Komar ship." As they prepared to leave, Redfeather approached Greg. "Your path is dangerous but necessary," the Native American leader said. "Remember, you carry the hope for a new understanding between peoples. Go with our blessings." The unlikely group, Greg, Linux, Zephyr, and Colonel Hawkins, set out at dawn. Their journey took them through treacherous mountain passes and dense forests. Along the way, Zephyr's abilities continued to develop at an astonishing rate. The child demonstrated an uncanny ability to influence electronic devices, allowing them to evade detection by both government search parties and extremist groups. As they traveled, Greg marveled at his son's growing powers while grappling with the implications. What would Zephyr become? How would the world react to a being with such capabilities? Their progress, though steady, felt agonizingly slow given the urgency of their mission. Each night, as they made camp, Zephyr shared more of the visions that plagued him. Glimpses of the Human Purity Front's preparations, the growing unrest in cities worldwide, and the Komar ship hovering ominously in orbit. On the International Space Station, Ambassador Reeves worked tirelessly. He coordinated with world leaders, convincing them to provide global media coverage for the family's planned broadcast. "This may be our last chance," Reeves argued, "to prevent a catastrophic conflict and secure humanity's place in the galactic community." As Greg's group neared the communication facility, multiple threats converged. Marcus Graves, having learned of their movement, rallied his anti-alien militia for a final assault. Simultaneously, Dr. Roth activated Human Purity Front sleeper cells worldwide, preparing to release the bioweapon. The communication facility came into view, a sprawling complex of satellite dishes and antenna arrays, nestled in a mountain valley. But as they approached, Greg's heart sank. The area was swarming with activity, government forces establishing a perimeter, Graves' militia taking up strategic positions, and Human Purity Front operatives attempting to infiltrate the facility. Colonel Hawkins surveyed the scene through binoculars, his expression grim. "It's a powder keg down there. One wrong move and it'll explode into all-out conflict." Greg looked at Linux, then at Zephyr. Their son's eyes glowed with an inner light, his face set in drive. "We have to try," Greg said. "The fate of two worlds depends on it." As they prepared to make their approach, alarms blared across the valley. The powder keg Hawkins had described was about to ignite. Greg took a deep breath, knowing that their next actions could determine the future of human-alien relations and Earth's place in the cosmos. Greg's heart raced as he surveyed the chaotic scene before them. The communication facility, their last hope for averting disaster, was surrounded by a swarm of conflicting forces. Government troops established a perimeter while Graves's militia took up strategic positions. Human Purity Front operatives slipped through the shadows, their intentions clear. "We need to move," Greg whispered, his voice tense. "Now!" As they began their approach, alarms blared across the valley. The cacophony of sirens mixed with shouts and the distinct sound of weapons being readied. The powder keg was about to ignite. Suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your positions!" Colonel Hawkins emerged from the government lines, his presence commanding immediate attention. He locked eyes with Greg and gave a subtle nod before turning to address his troops. "Secure the facility perimeter," Hawkins ordered. "Let no one through without my direct authorization." As the soldiers scrambled to follow his commands, Hawkins made his way to Greg's group. "I'll buy you as much time as I can," he said in a low voice. "Get to the broadcast equipment and do what you need to do." Greg nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Colonel." Just then, movement caught their attention. From the dense forest emerged John Redfeather and his group, their faces painted for battle. Redfeather approached swiftly, his eyes gleaming with purpose. "We will create diversions," he said, gesturing to his people. "Draw away as many hostiles as we can." Before Greg could respond, Redfeather and his group melted back into the trees. Moments later, explosions rocked the far side of the facility, followed by war cries that sent many of Graves's militia scrambling in that direction. "Now's our chance," Lennox said, cradling Zephyr close to her chest. They sprinted towards the facility, ducking low to avoid stray gunfire. Hawkins and his men provided cover, engaging any threats that came too close. As they reached the main entrance, Greg could hear the colonel barking orders, coordinating a fierce defense against the encroaching forces. Inside, the facility was a maze of corridors and equipment rooms. Greg's military training kicked in as he led his family through the complex, avoiding patrols and using service tunnels to make their way to the central broadcast room. As they worked to set up the equipment, Zephyr squirmed out of Lennox's arms. The child's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light as he approached the control panel. Tiny hands reached out, and suddenly the machines hummed to life, displays flickering with information far beyond their normal capabilities. "He's interfacing with the technology," Lennox said, her voice filled with awe. "Enhancing it." Greg watched in amazement as Zephyr manipulated the equipment, boosting its power and range far beyond what should have been possible. But their progress was interrupted by the sound of gunfire, much closer now. The door burst open, and Dr. Roth stormed in, flanked by Human Purity Front operatives. In his hand, he clutched a vial of pale blue liquid, the bioweapon. "Step away from the controls," Roth snarled, his face contorted with hate. "Or I'll release this and end your alien plague right here." Greg moved to shield his family, his mind racing for a solution. But before he could act, Zephyr stepped forward, his small form radiating an intense energy. Suddenly, Dr. Roth's eyes widened. The vial slipped from his fingers, shattering harmlessly on the floor. The scientist clutched his head, overwhelmed by a flood of images and emotions. What is this?" Roth gasped, staggering back. Greg realized Zephyr was projecting his thoughts, forcing Roth to experience the unity and potential of human-alien cooperation. The child's mental assault left Roth reeling, creating the opening Greg needed. In a swift motion, Greg disarmed Roth and subdued him. The other operatives, caught off guard by their leader's incapacitation, were quickly overwhelmed by Lennox and Greg working in tandem. With the immediate threat neutralized, Greg turned back to the broadcast equipment. "We need to do this now," he said urgently. Lennox nodded, taking her place beside him. Zephyr, his powers still surging, placed his hands on the control panel once more. As Greg began to speak, he could feel the weight of two worlds resting on his words. "People of Earth and our Komar friends in orbit," Greg began, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We come to you with a message of hope and unity." As they spoke, sharing their story and vision for a peaceful future, the impact was immediate and far-reaching. Outside the facility, the sounds of battle began to subside. Combatants on all sides paused, drawn in by the broadcast that seemed to emanate from every device capable of receiving a signal. In orbit, aboard the International Space Station, Ambassador Reeves watched with held breath as the broadcast reached global channels. He had successfully secured the media link, ensuring the message would not be blocked or interfered with. High Emissary Zorax, who had been preparing to depart Earth's orbit, halted the Komar ship's engines. The alien leader's multifaceted eyes reflected the image of Greg, Linux, and Zephyr on the console, a family bridging the gap between two worlds. Back at the facility, Marcus Graves realized his support was crumbling. Soldiers and militia alike lowered their weapons, captivated by the broadcast. In a desperate bid to regain control, Graves rallied his most loyal followers for a final assault on the broadcast center. Colonel Hawkins, seeing the threat, sprang into action. "With me," he shouted, leading a group of soldiers to intercept Graves's forces. The two groups clashed in a fierce skirmish near the facility's main entrance. Gunfire erupted, punctuated by the dull thuds of hand-to-hand combat. Hawkins fought his way through the melee, his eyes locked on Graves. The militia leader, seeing his plans unraveling, raised his weapon to take aim at the broadcast center. But before he could fire, Hawkins tackled him to the ground. They grappled fiercely, rolling across the blood-stained earth. With a final decisive blow, Hawkins subdued Graves. As he snapped handcuffs onto the militia leader's wrists, he saw the fight go out of the remaining attackers. Graves' capture marked the end of organized resistance. Inside the broadcast room, Greg, Linux, and Zephyr concluded their message. The family's words, amplified by Zephyr's unique abilities, had reached every corner of the globe and beyond. As they stepped away from the equipment, exhaustion finally overtook them. Greg pulled his family into a tight embrace, feeling the tremors of adrenaline and emotion course through them. They had done it. They had averted immediate disaster and opened the door to a new future. But as the initial euphoria faded, Greg knew their work was just the beginning. Pockets of resistance would remain, and the long-term implications of the day's events were yet to be fully realized. As they prepared to face the world outside the broadcast room, Greg steeled himself for the challenges that lay ahead. The immediate crisis had passed, but the true test of human-alien relations was just beginning. The broadcast room fell silent as Greg, Linux, and Zephyr stepped away from the equipment. Exhaustion washed over them, the weight of their actions settling in. Outside, the sounds of conflict had died down, replaced by an eerie quiet. Colonel Hawkins burst through the door, his uniform stained with sweat and grime. "We need to move you immediately," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "It's not safe here." Greg nodded, gathering his family close. As they exited the facility, he was struck by the scene before him. Soldiers and militia members alike stood motionless, their weapons lowered, eyes fixed on portable devices still broadcasting their message. Hawkins ushered them into an armored vehicle. As they sped away from the facility, Greg caught glimpses of a world transformed. People filled the streets, their faces a mix of wonder and apprehension. Overhead, news helicopters circled, their cameras trained on the Komar ship now visible in the sky. Days blurred together as Greg, Linux, and Zephyr were moved to a secure location. Their temporary home was a nondescript building on a military base, its walls fortified and windows tinted. Despite the isolation, they were not idle. Zephyr's growth continued at an astonishing pace. Within weeks, he resembled a preteen, his hybrid features becoming more pronounced. Greg watched in awe as his son effortlessly interfaced with the advanced communication systems installed in their quarters. One morning, as Greg sipped coffee and Linux pored over reports of global reactions to their broadcast, Zephyr approached them. His eyes glowed softly as he raised his hands, and suddenly the air between them shimmered. A three-dimensional hologram materialized, depicting Earth surrounded by a network of twinkling lights. "The galactic community," Zephyr explained, his voice deeper than Greg remembered. "I can see it all now." Linux reached out, her fingers passing through the holographic stars. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Their moment of wonder was interrupted by a knock at the door. Colonel Hawkins entered, followed by a familiar face. "Ambassador Reeves," Greg said, standing to greet him. Reeves smiled, though fatigue lined his face. "I came as soon as I could. The situation up there," he gestured skyward, "has been intense." He proceeded to brief them on the global reaction to their broadcast and the subsequent landing of the Komar ship. The UN is convening an emergency session, Reeves explained. They're calling it the Terran Accords. We need you there. Greg exchanged glances with Linux. Us? Reeves nodded. You're the bridge between our worlds. Your presence is crucial. As they prepared to leave, news reports flickered across the screens in their quarters. Footage showed the chaos unfolding in cities worldwide. Crowds gathering in the streets, some celebrating, others protesting. Amidst the frenzy, explosions rocked several major cities. The Human Purity Front, Hawkins growled. They're lashing out. Greg's heart sank, but he steeled himself. They had known this wouldn't be easy. The journey to the UN headquarters was tense. Their convoy moved through streets lined with a mix of cheering supporters and angry protesters. Greg held Linux's hand tightly, Zephyr seated between them, his young face set in concentration. As they entered the Grand Assembly Hall, a hush fell over the gathered dignitaries. Greg felt the weight of countless eyes upon them as they made their way to the central podium. Beside him, Zephyr's form shimmered slightly, his hybrid nature on full display. High Emissary Zorak stood waiting for them, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the lights of the chamber. The alien leader inclined his head in greeting, a gesture Greg returned. For hours they worked tirelessly, Zephyr's holographic projections facilitating communication between humans and Kyomar in ways previously unimaginable. Complex concepts flowed between species, rendered in vivid, interactive displays that floated above the assembly floor. As night fell, the first draft of the Terran Accords took shape. Greg felt a glimmer of hope as he watched human leaders and alien delegates alike nod in agreement over key points. Their progress was suddenly interrupted by a commotion outside the chamber. Security personnel rushed in, surrounding the delegates. There's been an attack, one of them reported. Human Purity Front. They've hit targets in multiple cities. Screens around the chamber lit up with footage of destruction, smoke rising from government buildings, panicked crowds fleeing through streets. Greg's fists clenched at his sides. Zorak stepped forward, his alien features set in what Greg had come to recognize as willpower. We can help, the Komar leader said, his words translated by Zephyr's holographic interface. Allow us to share our defensive technology. There was a moment of tense silence before the Secretary General nodded. We accept your offer with gratitude. As plans were quickly formulated to counter the terrorist threat, Greg found himself pulled aside by Ambassador Reeves. There's something else you should know, Reeves said, his voice low. You and Linux, you're being considered for a new role, Earth's first ambassadors to the Galactic Federation. Greg blinked, the magnitude of the offer sinking in. He glanced at Linux, seeing the mix of excitement and apprehension in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. Before he could respond, Zephyr let out a sudden gasp. The young hybrid's eyes glowed intensely, his holographic projections flickering wildly around him. Zephyr? Linux reached for her son, concern etched on her face. So much, Zephyr whispered, his voice strained. I can see everything. As Greg moved to comfort his son, alarms blared throughout the building. On the screens, new footage appeared. A massive Komar ship descending through Earth's atmosphere, escorted by a squadron of human fighter jets. The chamber erupted in a flurry of activity. Amid the chaos, Greg held his family close, keenly aware that this was just the beginning. Earth was taking its first tumultuous steps into a vast, complex galactic community, and they were at the very heart of it all. 5 years passed in a whirlwind of diplomatic missions, technological exchanges, and cultural integration. Greg, Linux, and Zephyr became the public face of human-alien cooperation, their family a living testament to the potential of interspecies harmony. On a crisp autumn morning, Greg stood at the window of their New York apartment, watching the bustle of the city below. Hovercars wove between skyscrapers, their designs a blend of human ingenuity and Komar efficiency. He turned as Linux entered, her silvery skin glowing in the sunlight. Another day of meetings? He asked, noting her formal attire. Linux nodded, adjusting her translator pin. The Galactic Federation wants an update on Earth's integration progress. Zephyr's already at headquarters, preparing the presentation. Greg marveled at how much their son had grown. At 16, Zephyr looked like a lanky human teenager, save for the faint iridescence of his skin and the subtle points of his ears. His intellect and abilities, however, far surpassed his apparent age. Their comfortable routine shattered as Linux's communicator chirped urgently. Her multifaceted eyes widened as she absorbed the incoming information. "Greg," she said, her voice tense, "there's been an attack on the lunar colony." Within hours, they were whisked to a secure facility beneath the United Nations building. The room buzzed with activity as human and alien officials worked frantically to assess the situation. Ambassador Reeves, his hair now streaked with gray, approached them. "It's worse than we thought," he said grimly. "A radical Komar faction has taken control of the main habitat dome. They're calling themselves the Purity Preservation Front." Greg's stomach nodded. "Casualties?" Reeves shook his head. "None reported yet, but they've got hostages, and they've made demands." As Reeves outlined the situation, Greg felt a chill run down his spine. The extremists, led by a Komar scientist named Vexilor, were demanding the separation of all human-alien couples and the exile of hybrids like Zephyr. Linux's hand found Greg's, squeezing tightly. "They want to undo everything we've worked for," she whispered. Zephyr burst into the room, his eyes glowing with intensity. "I have a plan," he announced, his voice deeper than Greg remembered. "But it's risky." As Zephyr outlined his proposal to create a mental link between the members of a joint human-alien task force, Greg felt a mix of pride and fear. His son's abilities had grown exponentially, but the strain of maintaining such a connection could be dangerous. Colonel Hawkins, now commander of Earth's fledgling Space Force, listened intently. "It could give us the edge we need," he mused, stroking his salt and pepper beard. Greg and Linux exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Linux spoke. "We agree, but on one condition. Zephyr stays here to coordinate. It's too dangerous for him to be on the front lines." Zephyr opened his mouth to protest, but seeing the tenacity in his parents' eyes, he nodded reluctantly. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparations. Greg and Linux, drawing on years of experience working together, were tasked with leading a small infiltration team. Their mission, disable the habitat's internal security systems to pave the way for the main assault. As they donned their sleek, Komar-enhanced spacesuits, Greg caught Linux's eye. "Just like old times, huh?" he said with a wry smile. Linux's mandibles clicked in amusement. "Let's hope this goes better than that time on Proxima B." The journey to the moon was tense and silent. Greg watched Earth shrink behind them, a blue marble suspended in the void. He thought of Zephyr, already hard at work in the control center, preparing to link their minds. As they approached the lunar surface, the habitat dome came into view. Once a shining beacon of human-alien cooperation, it now bristled with improvised defenses. Vexilor's forces had repurposed mining equipment into formidable weapons. Initiating diversion, Hawkins's voice crackled over the comm. A series of explosions blossomed along the dome's outer defenses, drawing the attention of the extremists. Greg and Linux's team slipped from their lander, using the confusion to make their way to a maintenance airlock. As they cycled through, Greg felt a sudden presence in his mind. "The link is active?" Zephyr's voice echoed in his thoughts. "Everyone online?" A chorus of mental affirmations followed. Greg marveled at the clarity of the connection, feeling the presence of each team member as if they were extensions of his own body. They moved through the habitat's service tunnels with unprecedented coordination. Greg could sense Linux's movements before she made them, anticipating her actions with perfect synchronicity. As they neared the control center, resistance stiffened. A group of Komar extremists ambushed them, wielding energy weapons that crackled with blue lightning. Through the mental link, Greg coordinated their response without a word. He ducked as Linux fired over his head, her shot striking an attacker's weapon and causing it to overload. The resulting explosion cleared their path. They breached the control center to find Vexilor waiting. The Komar scientist stood tall, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the emergency lights. "You're too late," Vexilor declared. "The message has already gone out. Across the galaxy, Our brothers and sisters are rising up to preserve the purity of their species. Linux stepped forward, her translator rendering her words in flawless Komar. Vexilor, you're a scientist. You know that diversity, that hybridization, has driven evolution forward countless times across the galaxy. Vexilor's mandibles twitched, a sign of uncertainty. But at what cost? We lose what makes us unique, what makes us Komar. Greg joined his wife. We don't lose anything, we gain. New perspectives, new abilities, new ways of seeing the universe. For a moment, Vexilor seemed to waver. Then, through the mental link, Greg felt a surge of energy from Zephyr. Zephyr, no! He thought frantically, realizing what his son intended. But it was too late. Zephyr expanded the mental link, drawing Vexilor into their shared consciousness. The Komar scientist staggered, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of thoughts and emotions. Greg watched as understanding dawned in Vexilor's alien features. The depth of connection, the harmony of different minds working as one, shattered his preconceptions. With a keening cry, Vexilor collapsed to his knees. I understand now, he gasped. As quickly as it had expanded, the mental link contracted. Greg felt Zephyr's presence recede, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. With their leader incapacitated, the remaining extremists quickly surrendered. As Hawkins's forces secured the habitat, Greg and Linux rushed to the communications array. Zephyr, Greg called, his heart pounding. Son, are you all right? There was a long pause before Zephyr's voice, weak but clear, came through. I'm okay, Dad, just really tired. Greg sagged with relief, feeling Linux's arms encircle him. They had done it. They had saved the lunar colony and perhaps the future of human-alien relations. As reports began to flood in from across the solar system, Greg realized that their victory here was just the beginning. The ripples of this event would spread far beyond Earth and its moon, shaping the course of galactic politics for years to come. He looked at Linux, seeing the same mix of exhaustion and persistence in her eyes. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family and as a bridge between worlds.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.